koutou ngā mihi nui, kia koutou, and it's wonderful to be here. And I have to say, I caused Gordy a few heart attacks along the way because I was coming, and then I wasn't, and then I was, and then I wasn't, because we have such a thing in Parliament called leave, and we only have a few people that can be out of Parliament at any one time. It is actually a sitting day today, and as of Sunday I wasn't coming because I had my leave cancelled, and then about 9 o'clock on Sunday I got an email to say that I was here, so I was just taking it, and I was out that door today. You know, right until you leave that door you don't know whether you're going to get called back or not, so I'm here and I'm really delighted to be here, because diversity, intersectionality around that are just topics that are my absolute passion, and it goes right back to my childhood. And some of you in this room, and I apologise, have heard the first part of my story before, but it kind of tells my journey about why I'm so passionate in this area and why I just keep going and going and going to keep fighting to make certain that we get a more inclusive society and keep celebrating the wonderful diversity that we have. So I was born on the West Coast. I also hail from partly from Cornwall as well, but also you might think my name's Italian, but it's actually Swiss, so my family came over, but I don't know anything about that part of me. I just know that that's my whakapapa, as it comes from Cornwall in Switzerland, but we lost stuff along the way because that's what happened back then. But when I was 11 months old, I was the youngest of 6, my father and mother decided that there wasn't much on the West Coast for us as young people, so they moved us to Templeton Hospital, and I grew up in Templeton Hospital in Christchurch. Dad was the secretary. Now, if you've never heard of that place before, it was a psychopedic institution, and back then, mid-1990s, anyone that had a cognitive disability, so Down syndrome, global learning delay, anything along those lines, they were actually incarcerated into institutions. And families would actually put them in there, and many times never see those kids and those young people ever again. And they could be in there from as young as 6 months old, right through until when they died as adults. So it was a pretty interesting environment to actually grow up in. The only staff house on the grounds of that institution. Look, honestly, I didn't know anything of the horrific side of it growing up. I thought it was a blissful environment to grow up in because I had freedom. It was on about 600 acres. It was this amazing environment. It had animals and it just seemed bliss to me. It had a farm, it had all sorts of wonderful things. But when I turned 16, I got a holiday job and an after-school job working in the actual villas, and I saw how horrific that environment was. And I think it was from that moment that I became really passionate and driven to change the world. And you know, it was something that I thought we have to speak out, because and I'm not going to tell you all the horrific things that I saw because it was horrific, but things like you would get maybe 40 to 50 people of a certain gender or a certain age group living in those villas, and they were under lock and key. And when I say a lock and key, as a cleaner, I used to carry around one of those big keys like this that would go into those very old locks. And these people were woken up at a certain time, herded into the dining room, and the dining room was just a lino floor so that it could be cleaned up, all the urine and everything like that, and the spit and everything cleaned up after their breakfast. Herded into the toilets where there wasn't one partition between the toilets, and they were made to sit there until they'd done something on the toilets. Communal showers, then herded into a big day room, and the day room again was all lino so that they could be cleaned up their urine and that afterwards, so it was easy for us to go in and do that. And often they were under the big key, locked in those day rooms, and often there would be the rocking, because that was the stimulation that many of them had. And they would get herded for a walk around the facility, or there was a swimming pool and a gymnasium, and if they were high enough cognitive level, they could go and partake in those things, but only when it was deemed that they could go. And all that people saw of them was their disability, and that was all they saw. They didn't see anything else about them other than their disability, and that was how society saw them. And some of you are of the age group, you think back to when you're at school. Do you remember anyone with disabilities in your classes? You know, kids now know that. Kids know that there are disabled people around them, but there is a whole generation that didn't have that growing up. I remember being at a course and the person was talking about this and said, hands up if you knew disabled people your age when you were growing up or you had them in your school. And my hand went up and I was the only person in that room. And that was when I was about 18 or 19, and that was when I was training to be a teacher. And it struck me that things hadn't really changed. And we still had people under lock and key for their disability. And we needed to do something about it. And so that's when I started to get quite vocal and started to see that we needed and understand that we needed to see more than the one label that defined those people and defines us, because all of us have so much more about us. And in recent years, that's also been highlighted with me. My sister has been disabled for probably the last 30, 35 years now and is in a wheelchair. And still to this day, all people see is that wheelchair. They don't see her as a woman, they don't see her as my sister, they don't see her as a pensioner, they see the wheelchair. And how frustrating it is when I go into a shop with her and that person asks me about what she would like. And those are the things we don't see in the reality about who that person is and who they make up. So when I became Minister for Women, I was going along to meetings and we were doing employment action plans at the time, and we had all the population groups covered. We had Pacific, we had Māori, we had older people, we had young people, we had migrants. So we had a whole lot of different employment action plans that we were developing so that people weren't disproportionately hit in future labour market shocks, that we were coming up with the solutions. But we didn't have women. And I said, I remember saying as Minister for Women, well, why don't we? And I was told, well, they'll be covered in everybody else's. I said, no, that's not right, because there's a difference between a Pacific man and a Pacific woman. There is a difference between, and so I was able to lobby hard, and we were able to get the Women's Employment Action Plan in place. The reason we needed that is because the difference is there. When you're talking about gender pay gaps, and the gender pay gap in this country sits stubbornly at about 8.6% at the moment. It's been sitting around that 10% for quite some time. But let's look at the Pacific woman's pay gap, and it's about 20%. Or the Māori woman's pay gap, and it's about 15%. And the reason for that is that we've looked at women as a whole, but we haven't looked at those groups of women that have been even more disproportionately impacted. It's the same in the education space. When I'm asking about who the leavers, the school leavers are that are leaving without NCEA level 1, I will get told, well, Māori are in this group. But actually it's different for Māori girls and Māori boys. And it's different for Pacific girls and Pacific boys. And if we ignore the differences, we can't fix the gaps. We have to actually identify where the issues are in all the different gaps so that we can come up with the solutions. We also, as has been said here tonight so many times, we have so many beautiful diversities in this country that bringing them together and hearing their voices makes for a much richer country. And not just hearing their voices, but acting on them, ensuring they're at the table. Now, in the last Parliament, I was in New Zealand's most diverse Parliament. We had 50-50, women and men. We had the most rainbow Parliament. We had the most ethnically diverse parliament. We had the biggest Māori parliament that we'd had. We had the biggest Pacific parliament that we'd ever had. And you know what? We talked about legislation for the first time that we'd never talked about before. And in the women's space, and I can talk about that really intimately because I was Minister for Women, we talked about things like changing the ACC laws for surgical mesh. We talked about miscarriage leave provisions, all of those things that are for women. We talked about changing the law around in the rainbow space for conversion therapy and self-ID on birth certificates, because we had the people and the voices there to be able to talk about it and bring authentic lived experience rather than seeing the world through somebody else's lens. So that's why we must look at intersectionality all the time to make sure that we just don't see one aspect of a person, that we see all aspects. So going back, I hate the fact that in New Zealand we had that in our history, that we incarcerated those people like we did. But at the same time, it's given me so much drive, and I know that we can change the world one step at a time, and we will. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou.